This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica. I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Marlis Juerging-Coles. Thank you very much, Marlis, for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So Marlis is early years teacher, management lead, freelance consultant, and champion of the social gift of language. So today we are talking about language, and specifically the power of play in the absence of language, bridging language barriers for EAL children. So Marlis, this is something that is of high kind of interest to you, and I know that you can talk a lot about this. And the first time I met you was at the EPOP Festival, Exploring the Power of Play Festival, where you did a talk about this. And I was really fascinated. So I thought I've got to have you on my podcast for more people to hear this. So we'll begin by kind of looking at what you write in your article, which is basically the three common factors emerging from all of your work around language and supporting children's language in settings. So I guess I'll let you kind of introduce those three factors.
Yes. So in my work, I've obviously, like you said, language is my big thing, and it's the thing that I've been most fascinated with in the early years. And I think for me, three common factors have always come out in any setting that I've worked in and in any consultation that I've had. And it always starts with the social factor, which is the obvious things like attachment, making sure that we get that settling process right. And then it goes into the fun factor and the play factor, which very much is about intrinsic motivation, making it something that isn't meant to be a chore, given that feeling of actually we want children to want to talk, not to make them talk into something that actually isn't relevant for them. And the power that play brings to that, the power that play has in a situation where you might not have the language to have full-on conversations, but play is hardly ever influenced by what language skills you have, because language is so much more than the spoken word. And I think those are the three factors that I always come back to, because they're just the most fascinating part of language acquisition and in how we as early as professionals can really support children in their learning.
Mm-hmm. And I really love what you say about the social factor. So you mentioned language is our social currency. I think that there's kind of so much to unpick there from that one phrase. So what do you mean by that?
So I've been thinking about how we quite often have a tendency to think of children who don't speak English as their first language or don't have much English skill at all as a child who doesn't have language. And that is totally disregarding what they already have. And it then puts us on the wrong track for actually supporting them correctly in actually learning English in the first place. So if we think of language more as a currency, then think of yourself when you get ready for an abroad holiday and you're really excited and you go and you exchange pounds for whatever currency is obviously for that country that you're traveling to. Because that's what we need to be doing. These children already have language. They already have something that they can express. They can express joy and sadness and anything in between. What we need to do is we need to motivate them into wanting to exchange that, to be able to then use English language as well. And that needs the big motivation. And it is also a way of then us understanding that because it's a currency, if you think about how any country will price anything that they sell, it is really important to bear that in mind. When you know that that child already has a currency from their own, whether it's their home country or their mother tongue. Obviously, not every child would have grown up in the country that has started their mother tongue from their parents' point of view. But if we understand that as well, we'll understand how much we can actually bring into that, how much we can tap into what is already relevant for each language and each child and their culture, and then use that when we try and encourage children to share themselves with us, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your article, you say we start from scratch when what we should be doing is building on their existing skills. So I think that's just such a great kind of summary of that, what you just said. So I know you also kind of talk about finding out words from the child's first language, but actually, would you encourage trying to use those words? Because I know kind of in your article and before I've heard you mention the fact that you don't necessarily, or maybe you shouldn't necessarily speak the words if you kind of don't know how to pronounce them as well. And it's more about knowing the words that the child says and knowing kind of what they're communicating rather than necessarily trying to communicate with them in their language, which isn't your first language or your language at all.
So it's a bit of a weird one, because I have now heard several times that Ofsted does have a focus on us being able to bring that language in ourselves. Now, both from a foreigner point of view, as in I haven't grown up in an English environment. I grew up in Germany and I didn't speak English on a daily basis until I came to this country at 19. And as a mother of bilingual children, I know that actually using words that you then can't follow up on, that's specifically, let's say we can pronounce, and that isn't actually necessarily the case, because even if you look at how things are pronounced phonetically from an English point of view, that gives us a false understanding of how things should be pronounced, because essentially as we speak, we almost create these magnets in our brain. And so these magnets are connected to the phonetical language that we have for us in the language that we speak, which means automatically whatever language we're trying to pronounce, these magnets are really strong and they will pull us in to try and pronounce things as our brain can connect them. That means that already we're at a disadvantage. We're also at a disadvantage because unless you've been surrounded by lots of different languages as you've grown up, those magnets will be very clear on just your language, which means they also disregard anything that isn't common to you, which means that very poignant differences that if it was my mother tongue, I would absolutely hear, because that is what my magnets have taught me, you wouldn't be able to hear. So you'd be at a disadvantage because you can't necessarily pronounce it, and you would be at a disadvantage because you wouldn't necessarily know that you've mispronounced it, because to your ears it sounds right. But even if we spelled it out in a phonetical way, actually even our phonetical alphabet doesn't include all of the sounds that we make. So for example, the letter L is pronounced differently in English depending on where in the word it is. If you have it at the start of a word, for example, love, it's at the front. It's a very soft love. But if you're having it at the end of a word or in the middle of a word, say in little, at the end, it dips up. So your tongue is no longer at the front of your mouth, it's at the back. Yet if you talk about phonetical L, it's so it's the first, it's the beginning of it. So if you look at it phonetically, now as an English speaker, you know the L will be different because you've heard it, you've heard the nuance. And even though you know that phonetically that isn't quite the same thing, you will be able to do it anyways. But if we're thinking about that, imagine if you're looking at your own phonetical alphabet and you already don't have all of the sounds of this language in it, what's going to happen when we try and apply these to a different language where we can't possibly then get to the right pronunciation? However, let's say we are all absolute language geniuses, and I will say there are people who can absolutely pronounce all sorts of things, specifically people who are in music. If you have a musical brain, your mind is already wired to understand differences. So say we are these absolute geniuses who can actually pronounce and will be able to hear the difference. So say you can say 15 words that are relevant to the child. Two things will happen. First of all, you are using their mother tongue with them in a situation where they might then feel either irritated by the fact that it's an environment where they don't expect to hear their mother tongue, or alternatively, they might feel, actually, this is great. We can now speak this language, and they'll then speak their language with you. And again, you are running into a wall because you can't then answer. And the side effect of that is essentially, regardless of how you then do it, you are creating a situation of mistrust. So if you are using words, if you speak the language, if you have someone in your setting who happens to be fluent in a different language and a child comes in, absolutely use that. Of course, why wouldn't you? But if you don't, essentially, I like to say, when at school, when you've learned certain sentences, or when you're getting ready to go away on holiday and you go, do you know what, I'm not going to be typical. I'm going to learn this sentence. And you learn, say the sentence, where's the next bus stop? Beautiful. You've found out how to pronounce this. Would you know how to deal with the answer? Would you understand the answer? You ask the question, would you understand the answer? No. If the answer to that question is no, what was the purpose of you having that? And I think that's how we need to look at it. If we can learn words that are relevant for our children in our care, for the sole purpose of us understanding, therefore being able to react, therefore creating a bond, that's amazing. That is amazing. That is what we want. We want to make sure that we have those close connections with the children, that they feel like they can make themselves heard where it's important, where it's in regard to a need. But we are always going, but it is in an English environment. So yes, I understand that you've just asked me to do that. And I will respond to you in English. Oh, you need to go to the toilet. Come on, I'll show you where it is. It feels somewhat counterintuitive when we're saying, well, we want to bring these children in. But actually, if you think it through, and that's where I go with the bus stop idea, unless you can follow it through, unless you can give these children more than, actually, what you've told them is, you're safe now, you can speak that language, and they use it, and you go, oh.
Mm-hmm. So they open up, and then actually it's almost like they're tricked into talking their language and believing that you can understand, and they get excited about it. And then you're like, I have no idea what you're saying.
And again, depending on the age of the child, it then also gives that there's a really false impression of, we as adults understand that there is a set of vocabulary that belongs to one language and a set of vocabulary that belongs to a different language. Children don't necessarily know that. So a child won't necessarily, specifically a child who isn't around many other languages, won't grow up thinking, but what I'm saying isn't going to be understood by everybody and they won't be able to speak back. So it's also important that we very gently, obviously, but that we give that understanding of, there is a break. There isn't, the words that you are using are still currency, only in my country, you need a different currency in order to buy. You can still buy the same stuff, but you will need the currency that is for this country to be able to do that. And that's a very, very tricky one to get right, specifically if we are trying to bring them in by initially saying, oh, but the first £10 I'll give you for free. That it doesn't set them up for the right path, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just so interesting to really reflect on this and unpick this, because like you say, we're encouraged often to know a few words in a child's language, and also the whole thing around putting up words from a child's language is something that I always talk to my university students about, in terms of language in the environment, and they, maybe kind of quote what they've heard before or what they've seen in settings of putting up kind of, the word toilet where the toilet is. But actually, are the children who may be 2, 3, even 4 years old, can they read, what you put up there? And then can they read at all, let alone read in their own language? So it's just about really being reflective of every single thing that you're doing and the language that you're using and why, and if it actually is useful, or is it tokenistic, like the written language, the labels, or even like you say, the pronouncing the words from the child's first language, is that a little bit tokenistic as well, because we're just kind of ticking the box of saying, well, I understand you, I'm being respectful, I've learned a couple of words, I can communicate with you, but not to kind of the full capacity, not in depth, and not truly in like a reciprocal way.
And I do think we also need to bear in mind that any country is a big country, and that there'll be different words, and culture will have impacted language differently. So so for example, the place that I come from in Germany, which is the north, is the part that probably will be taught the most. Just like if you learn English, the sort of, not Cockney, but the London accent in general, Southern accent will be what you get taught as a foreigner.
It's more common, yeah.
But if you end up in Newcastle, it's got to be a totally different word for certain things. And that's still the same language, but it's a cultural difference. It's a locational difference. And it can just be as small as a family. And I mean, I always encourage people, generally, not everybody calls, you know how we say, oh, what do you call your grandparents? If we have the grandmother say pick up, we say, oh, who is it? Is it Nana? Is it Granny? Is it Grandma? Because we want to know, what does that child call them, so that we can give the right name, because we understand a child will have different names. Not everybody will have the same name for their grandmother, say. But we don't give that same respect to even something as mum and dad. We just automatically assume we have mummy and daddy. But in a different culture, you won't do that. And equally, there are names that you don't then use. There are many cultures, including my own, where there are names that you call your children, for example, or that your child calls you, that would be totally disrespectful if it was used by anybody else. And I think that's where we then tap into the social gift of language, is more than just the idea of for this one child, because we as early as professionals already know that child isn't this isolated little thing. It's an entire universe by itself. So if we can tap into the fact that there are connections that might be totally individual to that particular family, never mind their culture and their actual language, it might just be in that family. So if we can do that for every child, regardless of language background, what do they refer to you as? What do they refer to themselves as? And being able to just take it from a point of curiosity and genuinely wanting to make that connection, we're already winning. We're already winning, because that is the environment that is inviting, where a child then feels at home and understood and heard. And again, it's important that we know if they're talking about mushka or mama, or that is their mother for them. How much easier would it be if that was something that we could pick up? And I don't need to repeat it back. I can repeat back, oh, your mum is coming to get you in a bit. Having that dialogue, it doesn't need to be in a child's language to make them feel understood. That's the magic. That's the magic of it all.
Yeah, because we can feel understood without language, and that's what you talk about as well in your article, don't you? And the fact that you don't need to use language to feel connected. There's kind of so much more at play. Actually reminds me of the 100 languages that Loris Malaguzzi talks about. When you were saying earlier that language is not just that spoken language. So of course this applies perfectly here. And I think that this kind of goes on to the fun factor, and also you talking about creating an environment that doesn't rely on language to be accessed. And you say that ironically, we create an environment that invites the use of language more so.
Yes. So I think one of the first things that I talk about very much, specifically when we're thinking about the fun factor. So once we've understood language is a currency and we want them to exchange it, and we've made that connection and we've gotten their families involved where that's possible, then we obviously need to be at a place where we're going, okay, so where next? And I think the first thing we should really reflect on is how easily accessible is our setting, is our environment without language. So if I like what you're saying in terms of the whole having signs up, but exactly like you said, what is that going to say to a child? And also be very careful, because Google Translate isn't your friend. It really is not. But it's then can a child take anything out? There are obviously some cultures where you'd genuinely have to invite a child physically and get them to play, because not every child will automatically assume that they're allowed to play. But then it's things as, if it takes language for a child to access the situation, you've already built a barrier. If a child is only allowed to play in a certain way, you've already built a barrier. If a child isn't allowed to touch all of the equipment and all of the resources that are on their level, you've already built a barrier. Because if they need language, almost like see it as a slot machine. If they need, when you travel and you desperately need the toilet, and you get to the
yes.
and then there's the barrier and you don't have the money.
That's so annoying.
See yourself as that. Imagine you are at the point where that child is ready, where they want to get into the environment. That's what you want. Because if you think about what motivates you to have a conversation with anyone, with a neighbor, with a friend, with your parents, with your partner, what motivates us is something that is dear to us, something that's important. And that more often than not is joy. Sometimes it's sadness, but it's wanting to share something. So if I'm already building that barrier and I'm already going, well, you can't get in because you didn't have the 50p ready to go and stick into it, that's the first part. So if we could create an environment where a child can access the environment without having to ask, then automatically they can create a safe space for themselves, and they can go into play as they feel comfortable, and you are then much easier slotted in, rather than you having to somehow entice them to come in. And already whether it's a total, obviously we have those social butterfly children who are amazing, who will probably just get into anything anyways, but we also have the children who just aren't, and who will feel really anxious. And imagine what we are creating when the first thing we're doing is we're building up anxiety in a child for accessing play, for wanting to go into an environment. And I think one of the really big things that we need to remember is that no child in our setting has chosen to be there, not a single child, never mind the child that comes from a different cultural background. And regardless whether their parents have made the best choices, and if you're like me, you obviously think that your setting is the best and clearly wonderful, but not a single child has chosen to be there. So if the
That's a really good point.
If the best thing we're doing is, imagine this is a child thrown into the sea and they can't swim. And if the first thing we're doing is shouting at them, well, you do this, that's all very sweet. Until we've pulled that child out, they'll be drowning. And that will forever be their experience. Their experience will forever be one of anxiety, one of, what if you asked me a question? What if I didn't get it? What if they could get it? What if they could follow their peers? What if we could model an environment for them where they can access things and really just get stuck in? Because again, our resources shouldn't be reliant on language already, because we're looking at, I mean, I don't know about most other settings, but certainly for the preschool that I run, we have children from 2 who aren't necessarily already great with their language. They often are very much at the beginning of their journey, regardless of their cultural background. And even more so in nurseries, where you then take them from babies. So our environment shouldn't be reliant on language. And the second it isn't reliant on language, you find it explodes in language.
Hiya, just a very quick and a very exciting announcement from me. The Voice of Early Childhood Conference is back. After the success of our first one, we have organised another one on the 16th of March, 2024. This will be a day full of learning, sparking reflections, sharing, discussing, and networking. Our overarching theme, which fits perfectly with the ethos of the Voice of Early Childhood, is advocacy, agency, and change. So we have Dr. Nathan Archer as one of our speakers, kicking off the conference with his keynote all around advocacy and activism in early childhood, followed by the rest of our brilliant speakers on the day, who are Adam Marriage, who will be discussing leading your team through Ofsted inspections, Dr. Stella Louis, talking about school readiness and intellectual readiness, a question of balance, Ben Kingston Hughes, exploring the power of play, Dr. Valerie Daniel, creative pedagogical practices to encourage agency, Ruth Swales, unpicking how do we construct our own curriculum, Helen Bately, talking about the foundations of early writing, and a special feature from Dr. Sue Allingham, Dr. Sue's surgery, which you can book into throughout the day. This is an opportunity for a one-to-one Q&A session with Dr. Sue, so really make the most of this special feature by coming prepared with your burning questions, whether this may be around practice, leadership, Ofsted perhaps, or anything else you can think of, you can ask Dr. Sue. We also have a whole conference discussion which is focused on sustainability in early childhood in the widest sense. So we'll be focusing on sustainable development goals, which we will discuss, debate, and really unpick what this means for early childhood and our responsibility as educators within this. Linked to this, there will be a student posters showcase around the Sustainable Development Goals, where we can engage in more discussion and reflections, really focusing on linking theory and academia to practice. So there's lots of in store for you on this really exciting day. And as always, you can expect on our conference day opportunities for shared reflection, discussion, and healthy debate, valuable CPD, a diverse range of speakers, a safe space to share your practice and thoughts, a relaxed atmosphere, plenty of opportunities for networking, a selection of exhibitor stands to explore and ask questions, and of course, fantastic food and refreshments as always. And for 2024, we really had to step it up a notch with a choice of workshops, so a leadership or a practice strand to choose from, a start of the day and an end of the day keynote, interactive sessions, and of course our Q&A with Dr. Sue, which is new. So if this sounds like the kind of conference and early childhood community that you would like to be part of, then grab your tickets before they sell out. We do have limited capacity. And if you haven't already heard, you can get 10% off to use at checkout by signing up to our newsletter. I've added the link in this episode description where you can sign up for your code, find more info about the conference and speakers, and access our Eventbrite page to secure your ticket. So I will see you in March. I just find that so interesting because it's actually the opposite to what we are normally kind of taught as best practice in terms of it's not about getting children to use English and kind of start, using that language, using the common language in the setting. It's actually about getting them engaged and involved first. And I guess it kind of doesn't matter if they don't use English because I guess it's their choice, isn't it? As long as they feel like they belong and they're welcomed. Of course, then it matters in terms of, those social interactions and they can get more, in terms of communicating with other children and playing. But initially, it doesn't matter if they're not speaking English words. You can't, make them and force them to do that. And that's not the focus. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
I think first of all, it's probably a question of confidence, because if you genuinely believe in your practice, if somebody came up to me and said, why aren't you making that child talk? I can argue my way into the sky with that, because again, it's what exactly is my purpose? And that is a great way to start. What is my purpose? What is it? So what if I'm teaching these children to ask for the next bus stop, but I never make sure that they'll understand the answer? Then I've achieved nothing. If anything, I've created a barrier that will be much harder to break, because what I've done is I've told that child, it doesn't matter. You don't matter. What you already have in the bank doesn't matter. What matters is that I can tick a box. That's not childcare. That's not what any of us who are genuine early years professionals are doing. We are not there to tick a box for us. We are there to create the best possible start in life for any child, regardless of background. And for that, we need to be confident in saying they shouldn't and they don't need to talk. We wouldn't expect a baby to start talking the second they come out the womb. Why? Because that's not developmentally correct. They just need more time. So in the same sense, we shouldn't ask a child who's just come into our setting, again, actually, regardless of cultural background, because there are also children who are just naturally shy, who have selective mutism, children who just aren't confident in their language. You don't know what their experience might have been with language beforehand. There are many children, again, possibly from a cultural background, but who don't actually get talked to. There's not necessarily conversation. There might be talking at, but specifically in a time and place where we have our phones out an awful lot of the time, how many interactions are children actually having? So I think that for me is a big deal in terms of it does take confidence, but they shouldn't need to talk. And I like referring back to Fer Levers, who is a Belgian professor who looked into the scale of well-being against the scale of involvement, which is the basis of all learning. So if we're not talking about the surface level learning, which would be things like being able to recite the alphabet, that's a great skill, but it literally takes you nowhere. Being able to recite the alphabet doesn't mean that you'll be able to read, write, speak, anything. It just means you're able to echo. So if we want that deep level learning, we need deep levels of involvement. That's what Fer Levers' research showed, and this is where his scales come in. And he said the scale of involvement, so the level of getting children really stuck in, is first of all based on their well-being. So a child who is anxious, a child who is in that fight or flight stage, a child who doesn't feel safe, isn't able to get involved, because it would mean having to let go of that feeling of, okay, do I need to run? Am I getting it right? So what we need to do actually is bring that well-being in first. And if we can get children to feel comfortable, if we can get children to feel safe, if we can get children to enjoy themselves, that's where they'll then get stuck in. And yes, then it is down to our expertise to make sure we scaffold things properly, to make sure that we bring in, again, depending on each child as well, how we can bring in language. There are many different ways. And I've often found that there are differences partially in genders. On average, not in every child, but on average, I found that girls have always invited me into their play, and it was a lot easier to show language and to model language in play situations, whilst boys didn't like my very obvious attempt to bring in language necessarily. But again, once you get them in a happy place, once they are involved, and then they'll start inviting you in, then they start speaking to you. And again, if they start speaking to you in their language, in a weird way, again, it doesn't necessarily matter. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what it is that they're saying. More often than not, we take cues from the environment. That's why when you are learning a language, it's a lot harder to talk on the phone. That's something to bear in mind when you do a settling process, because we take so many cues from the environment, from the situational perspectives, that actually the spoken word makes up, I think, 8% of the actual communication that comes through. So bearing that in mind, once we get the child to want to talk and they start talking, and we can somehow reciprocate that, whether that is by just going, oh, I really enjoy what you're doing, or by joining them in their play, or by just watching, by not interfering, but actually just going, I can see that you are taken care of. I can see that you are happy. I can see that you are playing. That is what I want to achieve. When they're ready, they'll talk. They might not talk to you. They might talk to their friends. They might talk to their parents. They might just come out with random words in their play. But any and every one of those, that is a celebration. And that is the part that will eventually lead to them understanding the answer to where's the next bus stop.
So I just wanted to kind of go back to something we talked about earlier, which obviously still links to what we're talking about now. So the environment, so obviously making children feel kind of safe and secure, like you say, that they're happy and they're ready to communicate. But first and foremost, that, their well-being and kind of involvement is higher than, if they're feeling anxious about things. But how do we create that environment that doesn't rely on language in terms of maybe more physically and not necessarily emotionally, which actually, it's the opposite way around. Usually we'll look at the physical aspects first and then we say, hang on a minute, it's not just a physical environment, but actually here, what does it look like physically? What does the environment look like physically? How can we set it up in a way where children can access it freely without language?
Well, I think the first thing that's important is considering what it looks like to a child at their level, because we look at it from high above and they might see it that way. So I always love, from a double perspective, actually filming the environment at the child's level. So walking around with a camera, just talking you through the routine of the day. Now, you don't need to use that video ever, although I strongly believe in doing exactly that, but we'll get back to that in a minute. But the first thing is seeing what it looks like to them. Can they actually look over units? I very much believe in having things no higher than head height for the smallest child in your room, because what that automatically does is they're able to see what is on offer. So that's the first thing. They don't need to ask where are things, because they can see where are things. Then it's anything that is at that height. In fact, again, if you can, not everybody has that luxury, especially if you have a pack away setting, but if you can, anything that can be touched, so anything that is anywhere from here up to just above head height, should be accessible to the children. Anything that they shouldn't be able to touch or shouldn't be allowed to touch really shouldn't be at a height where they can touch it, because again, it's a really difficult situation. If you have to explain to a child that they shouldn't be taking something, you have to be super careful with your body language, because it can feel so threatening, because you don't know what your language sounds like to someone who doesn't speak that language. And if that's their only experience of you communicating with them, then again, it can obviously become quite threatening. So I would always say, if at all possible, have things no higher than the head height of the smallest child, and always have anything and everything that's within the room should always be able to be touched by a child so they can access that.
So I guess anything that you don't want the child to touch because, it's not safe and it's not appropriate, then have it in a cupboard that is kind of out of view, basically. It seems like such a basic thing, but, there's no point telling a child off, or kind of making a remark about the fact that they shouldn't be touching this, or like they know they shouldn't be touching this. Actually, it's your fault that you left it there, because, of course, the child being curious, they will want to touch it. And actually, we encourage curiosity, and then we always tell children off for it.
Exactly. And again, that's coming back to asking, what's my purpose, and what's my, what I'm saying, for example, you shouldn't be touching. Do they know they shouldn't be touching that? And how would they know that they shouldn't be touching that? Again, regardless of language, actually, how would a child know that they're allowed to do certain things at certain times, unless you have somehow role modeled it? And again, how do you role model it then without needing the language to do so? Which is where we come back to the video, which to me is that if you are happy with the environment, if you've checked the environment, you've figured out, okay, I've got everything where I'd like it to be, I genuinely think that children are allowed to touch anything here. If you then do a walkthrough and then share that video with prospective families, then the child can talk that through in a safe space at home with their parents. They can ask all of the questions in their home language. So any questions that might have arisen in terms of safety, perhaps, the parents can talk them through already. And it means that because they experience it in a safe place, in terms of because they have their family member or their important adult with them in a safe space, it automatically translates into a safer space anyways. And for that, I then also always say, if you are changing things in your environment, whether that is because your pack away setting and certain things can and can't come out on certain days, or because you've decided, you know what, it's Christmas, it'll be brilliant, we're going to change all of these things, don't underestimate the impact that happens for that child. Because again, if they can't be prepared for it, then it can be really disheartening. Many children will watch first. Again, we have the social butterflies, super confident ones that will just get stuck in, which is amazing. But I also have come across, and again, regardless of cultural background, so many children who will stand at the sidelines, might touch it once and then walk away again, and take a real process. So imagine you get to that child who has finally gone, today's the day. Today I'm going to build something. Today I'm going to create something today. And they walk in and it's gone. And it's gone, and they don't have the language skills to ask. They can't say, can I get it back? So if your reasoning for not having things out, for example, is, oh, they can just ask. If they wanted, they know it's in that cupboard, they can just ask. But can they? Would every child have that? Again, not necessarily on a language basis, but generally in every household, that will be different. Not every adult in any household will be happy for a child to question why the adult has taken something away. That can be seen as quite subordinate behavior. And so would you always have that? So again, question, why do I have it like that? Is this something that makes sense? I call the majority of things, the sort of the setup that you always have your skeleton base. And if you change something about the skeleton base, then make a new video, share it for the children again, so that they know what is going to happen next. And then bring in things to scaffold each need as you go along.
So you're really involving the family there as well, in terms of ensuring that the family understand with the child what the environment is like, what to expect. And then also, of course, like I just said, what to expect from the setting, whether they're new to the setting or, whether they are coming in and they're seeing a change or they're going to see a change, and actually supporting that transition in a way, because, they may just be stepping into their own learning environment that they're used to, but only a small change might kind of throw them off, or if it's unexpected, it's still a transition for the child. It's still something to kind of understand that has changed. So I think it's on like more of a respect level, it's respectful to let the child know that, when you're coming in on Monday, actually there's going to be a little change here. And we just wanted to let you know, because it's, if we come into, I don't know, our office, or, if we work in an office, then and our desks are kind of switched around and everything's changed, then, we'd think, oh, well, this is looking a bit strange, or I didn't expect this, or this has kind of thrown me off a little bit. And we would be communicated about that, or maybe we'd even be involved in making a change. So I guess perhaps even involving children in constructing the environment is really important. And again, that's a respect thing, and having them have their own agency, choice, and say in how their environment is resourced, what it looks like, how everything is kind of placed as well.
Yeah. And I love the idea of just, again, it becomes so much more purposeful, doesn't it, when we include our children in all of those changes. And again, you can then have a mixed part, even you can talk about changes that you want to have, but equally you can track where children take things. If you find that a child consistently finds some, I don't know, a piece of guttering and takes it to a certain place because somehow they can elevate it and then they can roll a ball down, that is your cue. Again, it doesn't need the language then. It is very much okay, we need to do some rolling here. So obviously we're going to put something up there. And automatically, again, you are responding to something where on a level where it didn't need the language input, but it still translates and it still comes into that exactly like you just said. And then we're dipping into British values and prevent duty, where we're literally talking about actually feeling respect for one another, understanding that individual needs are exactly that, individual needs, and that we are prioritizing on a needs basis, but also that we are hearing every voice. Importantly, we are hearing every voice, and not one voice is more important than another. But that is the rule of law. That is the democracy. That is the conversations where we're going into a here you matter. And whether you have the language capacity to express yourself or not shouldn't be the barrier. Similarly to how we wouldn't say a child who is unable to walk or is unable to grasp, that shouldn't be a barrier for that child within our setting. We can always involve children. I will put as a bit of a disclaimer, exactly because you've just said involve all of the families, there will be barriers. Obviously, from point of view, there's a lot of things that you can put into place, but I don't want to be disrespectful of the fact that I know a lot of practitioners, including myself, actually, in many situations where we are trying to reach out a lot. And not every family will do that. And again, to me, that's quite important to mention specifically on the EAL basis, because I know that there's a lot of families who, for example, either feel quite conscious of the fact that they are foreigners. So I will find that often, specifically in show rounds, they will specifically then try and speak English with their children in front of me because they feel uncomfortable speaking their own language. And even after nearly 20 years in this country, I still often do the same. If I need people to understand what I'm saying to my children, I switch into English, even though that's unnatural for my relationship with them. I usually speak German, but almost in certain environments, I don't know, say they're doing something that I know will be frowned upon, I will say in English, darling, I'd really like you to stop that, so that other people can see I'm disciplining them. How weird is that? Already thinking about other people in a situation like that.
But actually, it's all about them and, making sure that they are doing the right thing. It's nothing to do with anyone else, but it's just, that concept that we have of, what do other people think about us and, social norms and things like that, which is so ingrained.
And the experience of a foreigner in this country will be a different one to everyone, but that is something that, again, we need to be sensible and sensitive with, because some people will have had a great experience and have been very much welcomed, and other people really will not have. There are people, including myself, again, who would have been questioned on their heritage, who had difficult experiences. But on the flip side, we also have the families who are very clearly going, my child is here to learn English. I don't need you to respect their heritage. I don't need you to learn any words for them. I don't want you to bring in all of these different things because I am responsible for their culture. You are responsible for teaching them English. So you won't always get that. And I do think that's important to mention, because it can get very frustrating, because I do think we're always talking about a best case scenario, of course. We're always talking about the best case scenario. So we have the parents on board. We build on that parent parent-setting relationship straight out. Everybody will have the best interest in mind, and everybody's views there will also gel up, because there'll be a reason why these parents have chosen your setting in particular. And unfortunately, of course, that's not always the case. I do think you can use that often, because I also think it's important to be able to say, I hear you, I understand. Yes, we are here to teach English. So what we're saying is, we need your help in order for us to be able to teach English. We need your help for your child to feel totally comfortable at home, but then also support us in being able to bring the other side in. And where we can see, I hear that you are frustrated with that situation. Let me explain to you why I'm trying to do it this way. And also then empowering them in understanding that we desperately, just as much as they desperately want us to teach English to their children, we desperately want them to speak their own language with their children, so that that doesn't get lost, that it isn't a sudden break in culture, that the child doesn't suddenly feel other than. We don't want the child to feel like they need to be something else in our setting. We want them to be exactly who they are, and hopefully bring in and get them to want to also exchange the currency. But I understand it as we want them to exchange their language currency. We do not want them to exchange their culture.
There's just so much to unpick there, isn't there, in terms of that, respect for other cultures. And this could be a whole episode in a series in itself. Really kind of understanding and respecting cultures, and really getting down to what the parents' kind of expectations, needs and wants are for their child, because they are the primary caregiver. But at the same time, still balancing that with our own kind of professional judgment and expertise and the way our setting works, and not kind of compromising and doing something almost against our setting values, I guess, in certain situations.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're, I guess, tapping right into the relationship with the parents in the first place, because again, everybody has got different expectations. I do think it is really important for ourselves anyways, and I think it's an interesting one where you're talking about respecting everybody's culture, but to be able to really genuinely respect and understand everybody's culture, we need to respect and understand our own. And in that, we also really need to be very strong on what our ethos as a setting is, so that we can be confident in saying, I understand that. And what I'm trying to explain here is that actually we are teaching English, and here's how, and here's the research that goes with it. And not everybody will have the time for that. I have many parents who just go, this is, I don't know, I chose your setting for convenience, or this, you do this part with my child and I do the part at home. And there's only so much that you can do about that. And I do think that's important. But we can but try. And sometimes it genuinely is just a question of both being confident in who we are and what we stand for, and being able to then show that, but also being able to come into a conversation from that basis of curiosity, really bringing in the, I'm not trying to preach to you. I genuinely want the connection with you as the parent as well. And I understand you want us to speak English. I understand that what I'm telling you is your child benefits from having these steps put in place so that they feel safe to then get English into that. And you can then quote things like fair leavers. That will be different in terms of which parent really reacts to that and who that resonates with. But you need to have that, you need to rest within yourself, I think, and as a setting, to be able to have that confidence to go, actually, I understand, and also here's what we do.
Yeah, so having that confidence in your own practice and understanding in order to be able to justify and, I guess, almost advocate for, I guess, the early years, because that's something that we always need to do in terms of, I guess, defending play in a way in itself, and then also giving reason for why our practice is the way it is, and the kind of the decisions that we make, and why they are benefiting their children, because it is about informing parents and supporting them, and, like you say, not making them feel judged, but also not like you're lecturing them as well. I think that's just such a fine line there, isn't it?
It is a tricky one, isn't it? And I do think it's so easy for me, I get quite defensive because I genuinely believe in what we're doing. And I do think that we get into that place of, it's really important for us to understand that reflection and asking questions isn't a negative. So reflecting shouldn't reflection should be unbiased. It shouldn't be to find fault. It should be to simply reflect, to figure out, what did I do? And that's where we then come into the question. I think we're so used to having something like, what are you doing, seen as a criticism, that we react to the criticism that probably wasn't actually used at all. Or if it was used, then that's a very silly way of asking that question, because I can quite easily tell you why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I think that's if we could shift the narrative that goes from every question is actually an accusation in a quote, in a sense, or every person who comes in and says to us, oh, but, I would like to understand why you're exactly doing that. That's not them saying you're doing it wrong. Or if they are saying you're doing it wrong, then it's a great opportunity for you to go, here's why. Let me explain to you why. Because you do need to have that. And every person is within their right to ask that question, whether we're talking Ofsted or parent or another practitioner, whether you have other agencies come in, they're all within their right to ask, why are you doing that? And then you can use that as a moment where you're going, well, why would you question it? Or you can go at it and go, actually, I'm so glad you asked. Let's have a conversation.
I guess it's going back to what you said about being curious. And if you approach things from that sense of curiosity rather than judgment, then you can also assume, or you begin to assume with that mindset, that other people are also questioning because of curiosity rather than judgment. And that kind of mindset shift really changes things, that little pause and, thinking, are they judging me right now? Or are they just being curious? And actually, if I assume they're being curious, then this situation can be so much more pleasant for everyone involved.
And I think in a weird way, even if they were being judgmental, even if genuinely they are coming in with criticism rather than the open curiosity that you would hope that it was, you are disarming them by answering it as if it was a question of curiosity, because they don't have anything else. Their only ammunition is their assumption that you will get it wrong. If you rest within yourself, if you are strong in your own efforts and you know that the practice that you have within your setting is something that you genuinely believe in, what is there to come? What is there to come from a question that is based on criticism and judgment? So if you ironically treat it as if it wasn't, it becomes disarmed without you ever having an argument.
It kind of reminds me of Ofsted inspections, and we're kind of going quite off topic here, but maybe it's worth a mention of the fact that, often you may be questioned by an Ofsted inspector and you may think, oh, they've asked me about this, that means they don't agree with it, and it's just that panic. So I guess it just goes back to really believe it, knowing firstly your ethos, your values, what you do and why you do it, and truly understanding it and then believing it and kind of living and breathing that, and being able to also communicate and justify why you do things.
And I think it's
the wrong word, but explain, I guess.
I think though, isn't it? And being able to have that conversation. And now, not every Ofsted inspector is going to understand it, just like not every person is going to understand it, because I do think we need to get back to the point where we understand Ofsted inspectors to be exactly that. They are human beings, and not everything is, they're not usually, or in my experience, certainly, they're not usually walking in to try and trip you up. So what if in any conversation that you had specifically with an Ofsted inspector, specifically whilst we're on the topic of EAL, what if you imagine that you could write their report for them? What if what you say is actually going to inform what they're going to write? Now, if they're saying, well, you are not using words in their language, you haven't got their language displayed everywhere, you are not doing all of these cultural things in the corner over there. If I rest within my practice and I know that the reason I'm not doing that is because for that particular child, actually, that's not relevant, because exactly like you already mentioned, actually, that child can't read, and my place here is to teach English. I want them to be valued in what they're doing, but I don't want to put it out that actually what they should be doing is always speak their own language. I want to encourage them to speak English. So I hold space for them. I make the connection regardless of language, and I give them opportunities to use English or their own language. If I can write the report for the Ofsted inspector, How empowering is that? Don't assume that they necessarily, again, there we go back to the assumptions and the actually look at curiosity. Don't assume that everybody understands every part of your practice, because why would they? The whole point of your practice being what it is for your setting is because you've created it like that. And if you can genuinely explain why you do what you do, more often than not, that should have a good outcome. That isn't a surefire way, just the same as I'm saying, when you're reaching out to parents, not every parent is going to have the same positive response. You are going to have people who just don't want that, for whatever reason, whether that is a trauma-based thing, whether they felt judged in the past, or whether they just genuinely are not interested. That isn't for you to figure out. That isn't for you to change. But what you can do is do the best from your point of view. And then it should, in a perfect world, get to a great inspection. And if it doesn't, then you can rest within the knowledge that you did everything you could. And more than that can't be achieved.
It reminds me of really focusing on what you can change and not what you can't. So, I think this is probably a good place to kind of round off our discussion. Well, thank you so much, Marlis, for joining and really kind of unpicking language and, sharing your own experiences as well. It's really valuable to do that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lovely conversation.
I'm sure the listeners will find so much value in lots of little snippets of this episode. And actually, if the listeners enjoyed this episode, then another episode that's really interesting and also quite linked to Marlis is actually in terms of really slowing down and listening to children and, observing children to really find out what they are kind of interested in and getting to know them, is The Skill of Observation by Tricia Mohamed. So do have a look at that one as well. The link is in this episode description. So thank you very much, Marlis, once again, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again soon.
Thank you.